Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Mesechet Terumot. We're up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnah should be Nishmat Neria Ben Svetlana Aranbai Menuchato Began Eden. Amen. The Mishnah cites some other situations in which Terumah may not be separated. The Mishnah says, En Turmin Zetim Ala Shemen Velo Anavim Ala Yain. We may not separate olives as terumah for olive oil, and we may not separate grapes as terumah for wine. Meaning, if someone has raw olives and olive oil and needs to separate terumah from both of them, he may not separate from the olives alone an amount of terumah that's large enough for both the olives and the oil. Rather, he must separate terumah from the olives separately and from the oil separately. The same is true of the grapes and the wine. The Mepharshim explain the Torah describes terumah as dagan min hagoren, grain from the threshing floor, referring to grain that has been fully processed, because the processing of grain is completed at the threshing floor when the threshed grain is stacked up in a pile and the pile is smoothened out. Therefore, the pasuk is teaching us that one may not separate terumah from grain or any other produce before it has been processed. Similarly, one may not separate terumah from unprocessed produce for processed produce, or from processed produce for unprocessed produce, which for us would mean you cannot separate raw olives or grapes. Raw olives or grapes in which you intend to make oil or wine are unprocessed. Therefore, you cannot separate terumah from olives and grapes for olive or wine. Now, if someone disobeyed this halakha and he did separate terumah from the olives for both olive oil and other olives, or from grapes for both grapes and wine, the terumah is certainly not valid for the oil, but the Tanaim disagree what the status of the olives themselves are, if the terumah is valid for the olives themselves. Vim tarmu, and if they did separate terumah from olives for olive oil and other olives, Bet Shammai omrim terumat atzman bahem, ubet Hillel omrim en terumatan terumah. Bet Shammai say that their own terumah is within them, meaning the separated olives contain terumah only for the other olives, not for the oil. And the Mefarshim explain that the other olives are now chulin, since terumah was successfully separated from them, but the oil remains tevel as well as like before. They remain tevel like before, and they continue to explain some of the separated olives, the one corresponding to the other olives, are terumah, while the rest of the separated olives, the one corresponding to the oil, are chulin, just like the other olives. A non-Kohen is not allowed to eat any of the separated olives because we don't know which one are chulin and which one are terumah. Therefore, he has to give all of them to the Kohen, but he can charge the Kohen the value of the olives that are chulin. Bet Hillel omrim, but Bet Hillel say en terumatan terumah, that terumah is not a valid terumah at all. Even the part of the terumah that was separated for the olives did not become terumah, because since a single terumah separation was made and part of that separation was invalid, the entire separation is invalid. Therefore, both the olives and the oil remain tevel. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey again continues to list other terumah designations that are invalid. En tormin min aleket umin shicha umin pe'ah. We may not separate terumah from leket, shicha, and or pe'ah. Now we learned this previously. The Torah requires that certain portions of the crop be left for the poor to take. They include leket, which is the one or two stalks that fall during harvest, shicha, the sheaves or stalks that were forgotten in the field, and pe'ah, a section of the field that has to be left unharvested in the corner. Because these portions are considered the property of the poor, the owner of the field cannot use them as terumah for his own produce. Umina hefker, you may not separate terumah from ownerless produce, meaning if produce was ownerless, hefker, right? At some point before the completion of the processing, it remains exempt forever, even after somebody acquires it. Therefore, a person cannot designate such produce as terumah for other produce, because it's not possible to separate terumah from exempt produce on behalf of obligated produce, like the Mishnah will tell us later on. Now, how do we know that ownerless produce is exempt from tithing? The pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 14, pasuk 29 says, "Uba Levi ki en lo chelek v'nachala imach." The Levi shall come to take Maaser Rishon, for he has no share or inheritance with you. When it says the Levi has no share or inheritance with you, the pasuk is saying that the Levi is receiving Maaser Rishon only from privately owned produce, which he has no share. Ownerless produce would be exempt from Maaser Rishon because the Levi has a claim to that produce just like anybody else. Now, even though the pasuk is talking about Maaser Rishon specifically, the same halacha applies to all the other tithes, including Terumah. The Mishnah continues, "V'lo mi Maaser Rishon shenitla terumato." You may not separate Terumah from Maaser Rishon whose Terumah has been taken. The Mefarshim explain, after the owner separates the Terumah, he separates a tenth of what remains as Maaser Rishon, which he gives to the Levi. A Levi who receives Maaser Rishon separates a tenth of it and gives that tenth to the Kohen. This portion that the Levi gives to the Kohen is called Terumat Maaser, the Terumah of the tenth. You don't have to, there's no need to remove Terumah Gedolah, which is the regular Terumah from Maaser Rishon, because Terumah Gedolah was already separated from the entire crop, including the part that later would be Maaser Rishon. Because the Maaser Rishon, in view of the fact that Maaser Rishon is exempt from Terumah Gedolah, it cannot be used as Terumah for other produce because it is impossible to separate Terumah from exempt produce for the obligated produce. Now the Mishnahs are specifically referring to, if you look at the words, Maaser Rishon, whose Terumat Maaser has been taken. That implies that before the Terumat Maaser is taken, the Levi can't separate Terumah Gedolah from his Maaser Rishon on behalf of other produce. Because since Terumat Maaser must still be separated from Maaser Rishon, it's not considered to be exempt, even in regards to Terumah Gedolah, even though Terumah Gedolah was already given. V'lo mi Maaser Sheni ve'ekdesh shenifdu. You cannot separate Terumah from Maaser Sheni and Hekdesh, even if they were redeemed. Now we know what's Maaser Sheni. In years 1, 2, and 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, after the owner separates the Maaser Rishon, the first tenth, he separates Maaser Sheni, the second tenth, which he brings to Yerushalayim and he eats it there. The Torah allows him, if he wants to redeem his Maaser Sheni with money, in which case the sanctity of the Maaser Sheni is transferred to the money. Then he takes the money to Yerushalayim, uses it to buy food, which he eats there. The money transfers back. The sanctity from the money goes back onto the food. And what's Hekdesh? An item of Hekdesh, which is something that was donated to the Beit HaMikdash, can also be redeemed with money. The sanctity of the item is transferred to the money, which becomes sacred in its place. And the Mishnah teaches us that redeemed Maaser Sheni and Hekdesh are exempt from tithing. Therefore, they cannot be designated as Terumah from produce that is obligated in tithing. Now, Maaser Sheni is exempt from tithing. Why? Because it's separated from the crop after the other tithes of Terumah and Maaser Rishon have already been separated. Now, when we say Hekdesh, you're also referring to Hekdesh that's exempt from tithing, because the Mishnah is talking about a case where somebody donated unprocessed tevel to the Beit HaMikdash and it was not redeemed until after it was processed. Because its processing was completed while it was owned by the Beit HaMikdash, it is exempt from tithing forever. We learned this out from the Pasuk in the Torah. The Mishnah continues, "V'lo min hachayav al patur, v'lo min patur al hachayav." You cannot separate Terumah from produce as obligated for that which is exempt, and from that which is exempt for that which is obligated. Meaning, on top of all the cases we said over here, another example of exempt produce is grain that has not yet reached a third of its growth. Like we'll speak about in Masechet Maasrot. Such grain is not subject to tithing, and therefore one cannot separate Terumah from it on behalf of grain that has grown a third, or vice versa. V'lo min hatalush al mechubar, v'lo min mechubar al hatalush. You cannot separate terumah from produce that is detached from the ground for that which is attached to the ground, and not from that which is attached to the ground for that which is detached from the ground. Both the portion designated as terumah and the produce from which you are and the produce for which it is designated, they both must be detached from the ground. For example, harvested grain or picked fruit. This we learn out from the pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 18, pasuk 26. Varemotem mimenu terumat Hashem. You shall raise up from it terumah of Hashem. From the fact that pasuk says varemotem, you shall raise up, that teaches us that you have to be able to lift up the terumah, which means that it is detached from the ground. The word mimenu, varotem mimenu, from it suggests that the produce for which the terumah is designated has to also be detached from the ground. You cannot separate terumah from the new crop which grew this year for the old crop which grew last year, and not from the old crop for the new crop. The Mefarshim explain terumah is to be separated from produce that grew in the same year as the produce in which it is designated. This we learn from the pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 14, pasuk 22. You shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, the produce of the field, year by year, meaning it has to be the same produce from that year. ולא מפירות הארץ על פירות חוץ לארץ, ולא מפירות חוץ לארץ על פירות הארץ. You cannot separate terumah from produce of the land of Israel for produce of outside the land, and not from produce outside of the land of Israel for produce of the land. The Mishnah is teaching us that even the produce that grew outside Eretz Israel was brought, even if it was brought into Eretz Israel and processed there, it is still exempt from tithing, because the pasuk says in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 27, pasuk 30, V'chol ma'asar ha'aretz mizar ha'aretz, any ma'aser of the land, of the seed of the land. Only the seed of the land is subject to tithing. Anything that grew in a different country is exempt from tithing, even if it was processed in Eretz Israel, and therefore it cannot be designated as terumah for produce that grew in Eretz Israel. And the Mishnah concludes, V'im tarmu en terumatan terumah, and if people separated terumah in any of these situations, their terumah is not terumah. That is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.